Hello and welcome to this TBI Talks briefing. I'm Ian Mulheirn. I'm the Executive Director for UK Policy at the Tony Blair Institute. And today we're talking about Brexit, and we have a new publication that we're going to be launching. Now, midweek last week, there was some excitement at the prospect of the possibility of a deal, or at least the decision to try and get to a deal being taken by early this week. Now, whether that will happen is anyone's guess. But if it does, it's going to contain a huge amount of detail, critical detail, running to apparently 1,800 pages of legal text, which will have huge implications for all sorts of different aspects of life in the EU. So we've published a new briefing today, and it's called Unpacking the Brexit Deal, What to Look Out For. And it's your guide to cutting through the noise of what will be no doubt a very complicated deal if and when it comes. To discuss that, I've got the report author, TBI's Brexit guru, Anton Spisak, to talk through the report and what it says. So, hi, Anton.
Hi, Ian.
And you've produced this report that cuts through the noise. It really cuts to the chase about what the big questions are, as well as some of the really detailed things that we need to look out for in this deal if it does eventuate. What, in your view, are the kind of the big questions that we need to be focusing on?
I mean, as you say, Ian, there will be a lot of detail in the deal. It may be over 500 pages of proper legal text, plus a lot of very detailed technical annexes running to a few hundred other pages. But if we really zoom out from this negotiating detail and all the arguments about level playing field and state aid and fish and what have you, then there are three big questions that people should ask when they see this deal. The first question is, what is the balance of rights and obligations within this deal? And we've heard a lot in the last few months about the need to protect UK sovereignty. But sovereignty is an abstract concept, and just like beauty, it is in the eye of the beholder. And the reality is that all international treaties contain obligations. And the question is less about whether the deal protects British or European sovereignty, and more about the rights that it gives to both sides, and then what is required of them to maintain those rights going forward. So what are the obligations? And really the question to be asked is about, does the deal provide a fair balance of rights and obligations? And we'll need to look at what kind of deal this is. If this is a thin deal, so if it doesn't really give both parties very many rights, but imposes a lot of stringent obligations, for example, in terms of level playing field, then it is quite an unbalanced deal. And this is something that the UK has been trying to avoid, and we'll eventually have to see if it's managed to do that. In contrast, you can imagine a scenario where the UK does secure some concessions, and indeed, the balance of those rights and obligations is a little bit better. So that's the really big first question that people should be thinking about. Then the next question really is about implementation. And, we have to think about this as a legal treaty. It's ultimately an agreement. And that agreement needs to get implemented in practice. And the second really big important question people should be asking is, what is the gap between what is agreed in legal text and what needs to be done in practice? We know that there will be a huge amount of change, inevitably, which comes from the decision to leave the single market and the customs union. But the question is, are there any things in the deal that can minimize some of those changes in practice? And if you, for example, look at some of the manufacturing sectors, there can be things like mutual recognition of conformity assessment, which is a very technical term, but what it really means is that some of the product safety standards can be avoided at a border, for example. And some of those things can be in the deal, and we'll have to cut through some of the detail to be able to see if that's really included. But if it does happen, then obviously both sides will need to get this implemented, and businesses will need to get new regulatory approvals. New arrangements will need to be done at the border. Potentially, new legislation will need to be introduced in UK Parliament to implement some of the level playing field commitments, for example. So all those things, are the things that need to be in place for the 1st of January 2021. if this deal is to be done. So that is the second really big question that people should be asking. And then finally, the last question is, what is this going to mean for Northern Ireland? And there was a lot of noise in the last few months about the Northern Ireland Protocol and the fact that the government really dislikes some of the aspects of that protocol that it agreed to last year. Now, the question for the deal is does it offer any alternative solutions to those questions? And if so, what does the government do with that piece of controversial legislation it introduced a couple of months ago?
Great, thanks, Anton. And you know, as you say, there's these big overarching questions that cover quite abstract topics. But what a lot of people will be interested in is what it means for, say, market access in terms of, you know, in their sector, for the kind of big ticket sectors like, I don't know, manufacturing, car manufacturers, you know, the city, fisheries, that kind of thing. So what should we look out for in terms of, and what's likely to change with this deal in terms of market access?
I mean, the first thing to say is that there will be a lot of change, whether there is a deal or not. And, you know, that really is a function of the UK's decision to leave the single market and the customs union. And the government, both the UK government, but also the EU member states governments, have been putting up a lot of preparatory notices to businesses in the last few months. And the reason for that is quite simple. It is that even if there is a deal, there will be a lot of change when it comes to customs and regulatory approvals that businesses will need to get, and, you know, all kinds of other legal requirements that they will need to put in place. So in that way, you know, there is a degree of change that will be really hard to avoid. But as I said, you know, there are things that, you know, the deal can do helpfully to minimize some of those costs. And, you know, in manufacturing sectors, for example, there are kind of two big areas that, you know, the deal can help with. The first one is customs. There can be some simplifications agreed in the deal that can ease the kind of burden that businesses will need to face when crossing the border. So things like mutual recognition of trusted trader schemes that can really help, you know, businesses that trade high volumes with the EU. In services sectors, you know, a lot will depend on what can be agreed for cross-border services. So those are the services that are really based, you know, in the UK. Those are the firms that, you know, have operations in the UK, but they provide their services remotely to EU member states, which, you know, in reality means that those businesses have to date been relying on the regulations of the UK to provide a service to an EU member state. Now they will not be able to do that unless the deal specifically contains some provisions for that. So, you know, things like mutual recognition of professional qualifications, whether lawyers are able to give the same kind of service to their EU clients from London, or they need to shift their operations to any EU member states. Those are the kinds of things that the deal can help with. But again, a lot of it will be contained in the detail. And, you know, the guide that we just published sets out some of those questions in a bit more detail.
And what about some of the things that we've been hearing about in recent days, like health checks on food entering Northern Ireland, and, you know, equivalents for the city and that kind of thing? Should we expect to see those things in this deal, or will they come separately?
I mean, you're absolutely right. There are some things which will not be in this deal, and those are the things that, you know, the EU has complete access over. So things like financial services and the access of the City of London to EU financial services is something that both sides have agreed will not be in this deal, but will be determined by the EU's own legislation. And we are still waiting for the Commission's recognition of equivalence. That's the technical term for this legislation, which the Commission has suggested it would decide on by the end of this year. So, you know, you would expect that there will be some political statements around things like that, because they're obviously very, very important, even though they may not be contained in the deal itself.
Okay, great. And I mean, obviously, trade issues tend to dominate the discussion here, but this deal will also have something to say about security. And so what do you think we should be expecting from the security parts of the deal?
I mean, it's an irony that people tend to forget this is not only about Britain's future relationship on trade, but also on everything else. So security, all the bilateral cooperation from research, innovation to things like aviation and transport. There's a whole suite of things covered in this deal, potentially. And there is an open question about whether all of these things will be concluded by the time that this will be signed off, or whether some of the potential detail in those areas of bilateral cooperation will need to continue beyond this year. On security specifically, there are three big questions that the deal will probably need answers to. One is about an issue of UK access to some of the EU's criminal and security databases. So at the moment, obviously the UK as a former member of the EU, but still in the transition period, has access to real-time data about what's going on in the EU security space, and vice versa. The EU has access to the UK's information. Now that's really, really important for the operation of border force and security services on both sides. And there is a really big question of whether that mutual access to each other's databases will be maintained going forward. Then the second question is about extradition. We know that the UK is extremely unlikely to stay part of the European arrest warrant, but there may be some kind of new arrangement on extradition agreed as part of this deal. And lastly, there is a really big question about what the deal has to say on the European Convention on Human Rights. That's a lot of people will know that's a really politically sensitive aspect for this government, which has made a lot of noises about its dislike for the ECHR. And if you look at the real detail of the EU's proposal from the spring, you will see that the EU wanted the whole security arrangement to be conditioned on the UK's continued compliance with the ECHR, and not just that, but also on the UK's respect of ECHR in UK domestic law through the Human Rights Act. So that was a really ambitious ask from the EU at the time, and we don't know very much about what is the eventual compromise here, but you would expect that there might be some link between ECHR and human rights safeguards and the kind of conditions for the future security cooperation to continue.
Right. Now, your briefing really goes into a lot of detail of things that remain to be decided. But if we step back a bit, we have a reasonably good sense about what the shape of this deal is going to be. Could you put that in some context about where the history of this debate has been, and how this deal, broadly speaking, compares to other sort of landmark things, particularly what Theresa May was proposing some time ago?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's very, very interesting. We have gone a really long way from of the last 4 years in terms of what the UK has actually wanted from the EU. Initially, there was a lot of indecision about whether the UK would actually stay in the single market or the customs union, and there was a lot of talk about the customs union or a customs union of a bespoke kind with the EU, and that reflected, I think, aspiration of Theresa May's government to really have a deep relationship with the EU when it comes to cooperation, both on trade and security, but at the same time, the need to balance some of those obligations that could bring, on things like the continued compliance with the European Court of Justice, EU law, and so on. There was, a strong dislike for political reasons of those things, but at the same time, there was a recognition that the UK has a lot to benefit from with a deep and special partnership with Europe, as the phrase used to be. Now, when Boris Johnson came into office in July 2019, a year and a half ago, that's changed completely. The government started from the assumption that all it wants is a very basic free trade agreement. No special, no deep, nothing like that, a very basic free trade agreement. Because the primary objective was to minimize any interference of that deal, of that future relationship with UK sovereignty. And that is, the context in which this negotiation has taken place. It's a very, very different context from the one that we saw during Theresa May's premiership. And a lot of those disagreements in the negotiation over a level playing field, fisheries, governance, and all the other controversial aspects really reflect that context, that the government wants a very simple Canada-style relationship with no extra obligations, whilst the EU, asks itself, what is the bespoke context in which this relationship needs to take place?
And if we think back to those kind of charts produced by the Treasury showing the economic consequences of different types of deal, I mean, if this deal does emerge, it's not going to be quite as bad as the no deal scenario and the heavy hits GDP that would entail, but presumably, from what you say, quite a lot worse than Theresa May's. So which is it closer to, really? Which kind of, what are in summary, the scale of the economic consequences of this deal if it were to emerge?
I mean, I think I can't remember the exact figures, but I think it was the Treasury when it did their economic assessment of a simple free trade agreement. It was about a 7% hit to long-term GDP, and compared to about 2%, I think, of Theresa May's deal. So it is really quite significant in the long term. And I mean, a lot of people will be focused on what impacts the deal has in the short term, and for really good understandable reasons. There will be queues probably in ports and in places of trade, so there will be those visible consequences. But the real significant impact of this new deal is in the long term, about how businesses decide to organize their supply chains, how they decide to organize their business operations, whether they decide to hire new people, whether they decide to make new investments. Those are the real tangible, perhaps less tangible, but nonetheless very important consequences of this new arrangement of the long term. And those are the things that we'll see only in a few years' time. But we can anticipate what might happen.
Indeed. Okay, and then finally, looking ahead to the next few weeks, what does all of this, the possibility of a deal emerging, mean for the government's controversial legislation on the internal market? And is there a risk that even if a deal is if we're moving towards a deal in principle, that we might somehow fail to get a deal in the end because of these issues?
I mean, that's a real risk, I think. But ultimately, if the government really wants a deal, I think the EU made very clear the conditions on which that deal can be done. And one of those conditions is that the government has to withdraw some of the controversial clauses from the internal market bill. And really, I think that's something that the European Parliament will not compromise on when it comes to ratification of this deal. For them, that's a fundamental principle on which this future cooperation needs to take place. And I think if there is a deal, then we would expect that it gives us some alternatives to some of those controversial aspects of the Northern Ireland Protocol that the government's objected to. There are two aspects. One is state aid, and the other one is, potential tariffs on goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. And, you would expect that there will be some, alternative offered for those two things in the final FTA. And therefore, the government will claim victory and say, that legal safety net that it said it was needed is no longer needed. So, that's my expectation. But if that doesn't happen, then obviously we are in serious trouble, because it will complicate ratification, and it would mean that even if there is a deal, potentially the European Parliament can strike down a deal as unsatisfactory.
Great. So even more hurdles to jump, even if we do get towards a deal at the start of this week. Anton, that's fantastic. Thank you for taking us through the paper with great clarity. We'll leave it there. Do urge you all to go to institute.global and download the briefing and let us know what you think. Thanks very much.